The theater was already buzzing long before the show even began. People filled every seat, their voices blending into a warm hum of excitement that echoed through the tall ceilings. The stage lights glowed softly, casting a golden shimmer over the deep red curtain. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening of performances, music, dance, and a few surprise acts. The audience expected talent, maybe even brilliance. But none of them had the slightest idea they were about to witness something that would leave many of them wiping tears from their faces. Among the performers scheduled that night was a little girl named Sophia. She was only 9 years old, small enough that the violin she carried looked almost too big for her shoulders. Her dark hair was tied neatly with a pale ribbon, and she wore a simple white dress that brushed her knees. To anyone glancing at her backstage, she looked like any other child, nervous, quiet, clutching her instrument as if it were both a comfort and a responsibility. But Sophia had a story that few people in that theater knew. She had started learning the violin when she was 5, not because anyone pushed her, and not because she had dreams of big stages. It began in the living room of a small apartment where her grandfather used to play an old violin every evening. The sound of that instrument had been the soundtrack of Sophia's childhood. Sometimes it was cheerful and playful, other times soft and thoughtful. Her grandfather believed music could say the things people were too shy to speak aloud. When Sophia turned 7, her grandfather became ill. His hands trembled, and the violin that once sang so beautifully began to fall silent. One evening he placed it gently into Sophia's hands and said, "Music lives longer than we do. Promise me you'll keep playing." Sophia promised. 2 years later, she found herself backstage at the theater, preparing to perform for the biggest audience she had ever seen. Her hands trembled slightly as she tightened the bow. Around her, other performers chatted excitedly, but Sophia stayed quiet. She didn't mind the silence. In it, she could hear the melody in her head, the one she had practiced 1,000 times. Out in the theater, the host stepped onto the stage and welcomed the audience with bright enthusiasm. One by one, performers came and went, singers, dancers, a comedian who had the crowd roaring with laughter. The energy in the room was light and joyful. Then the host returned and glanced at his cue card with a curious smile. "Our next performer," he said, "might be the youngest musician we've ever had on this stage." The audience murmured with interest. "Please welcome Sophia." The curtain parted slowly. Sophia stepped into the light, her small figure almost swallowed by the enormous stage. For a moment the audience simply stared. A child with a violin wasn't exactly what they expected in the middle of a lively show. Some people smiled politely, others leaned back, unsure what to expect. Sophia walked to the center of the stage and took a breath. The bright lights made it hard to see the audience, but she could feel their presence, hundreds of eyes watching. She lifted the violin to her shoulder. For a second, nothing happened. Then the first note appeared. It was soft, almost fragile, like a whisper floating through the theater. The chatter in the audience faded instantly. Conversation stopped. The room seemed to hold its breath. Sophia played slowly at first, drawing the bow across the strings with careful precision. The melody was gentle, almost like a lullaby. It carried a quiet emotion that felt surprisingly deep for someone so young. People leaned forward. The sound grew stronger, richer. Sophia's confidence grew with each note. The violin began to sing in a way that filled every corner of the theater. But just as the audience settled into the music, something unexpected happened. Another sound joined the melody. At first it was faint, just a few notes from somewhere off stage. Sophia didn't look surprised. In fact, she smiled slightly as she continued playing. The second instrument grew clearer. It was a piano. The curtain at the side of the stage shifted, and a spotlight revealed a man seated at a grand piano. He was older, with silver hair and gentle eyes. His fingers moved gracefully over the keys, weaving a harmony around Sophia's violin. The audience gasped softly. No one had mentioned a duet. The piano and violin began to dance together, their melodies intertwining like two voices sharing the same story. The music grew deeper, more emotional. Sophia glanced toward the pianist for just a moment, and he nodded encouragingly. The piece transformed. What began as a quiet solo blossomed into a powerful conversation between instruments. The violin soared, its notes rising high and bright, while the piano responded with warm, resonant chords. In the audience, people sat completely still. Some clasped their hands together. Others simply stared at the stage, captivated by the connection between the little girl and the pianist. The music shifted again, becoming softer and more delicate. The violin whispered a melody that sounded almost like a memory. The piano answered gently, wrapping the sound in a tender harmony. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes. She wasn't the only one. The emotion in the music seemed to reach everyone differently. For some, it reminded them of childhood. For others, it felt like remembering someone they had lost. On stage, Sophia played with surprising maturity. Her small fingers moved confidently along the strings, drawing out notes that carried both innocence and depth. The pianist watched her carefully, adjusting his tempo to match her rhythm. It was clear they trusted each other completely. The music built slowly toward a powerful climax. The violin's melody grew bold and passionate, soaring above the piano's rolling chords. The sound filled the theater with an energy that felt almost overwhelming. And then, suddenly, the music stopped. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then Sophia began the final melody. This time it was softer than anything before. Each note felt like a quiet goodbye. The piano joined her gently, supporting the violin's fragile voice. The ending approached slowly, like the final moments of a sunset. One last note from the violin lingered in the air. The piano answered with a soft chord. And then the music faded into silence. For several seconds, no one moved. The audience simply sat there, stunned. Then someone stood. Another followed. Within moments, the entire theater rose to its feet in a thunderous standing ovation. The applause filled the room like a wave, echoing off the walls and ceiling. People clapped, cheered, and many wiped tears from their faces. Sophia looked surprised. She lowered her violin slowly, her eyes wide as she gazed out at the crowd. The pianist stood from the bench and walked over to her. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and bowed slightly toward the audience. But the applause didn't fade. If anything, it grew louder. The host returned to the stage, shaking his head in disbelief. "I think," he said with a laugh, "we just witnessed something very special." Sophia smiled shyly. The host turned to the pianist. "Was this planned?" The man chuckled softly. "Only partly," he admitted. Sophia asked if I would join her, but she didn't tell me she was going to play with that much heart. The audience laughed warmly. Then the host looked at Sophia. "Why this song?" he asked. Sophia hesitated, gripping her violin gently. "My grandfather used to play it," she said quietly. "He taught me how to love music." A hush fell over the theater. The pianist looked at her with new understanding. "Where is he tonight?" the host asked. Sophia smiled softly. "He's listening," she said. In that moment, the emotion of the performance suddenly made sense to everyone in the room. The standing ovation began again. And somewhere in the back of the theater, a man whispered to his friend, "I'll never forget this night." Neither would anyone else. Because sometimes the most powerful performances don't come from famous stars or grand productions. Sometimes they come from a little girl, a violin, and a melody that carries the love of someone who once believed music could speak when words fail. And on that night, it did.